Margaret Calloway had lived in the Hargrove Heights condominium complex for 11 years. And in that time, she had appointed herself the unofficial moral authority of every hallway, elevator bank, and parking garage in the building. She was the kind of woman who filed noise complaints at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, who left passive-aggressive notes laminated in plastic sheeting on neighbors' doors, and who attended every single HOA meeting as though the fate of Western civilization depended on whether or not someone's welcome mat was 2 inches too wide. She wore her position as HOA board treasurer like a military decoration, and she wielded the building's maintenance override codes, which she had convinced the property manager to give her for emergencies like a scepter. Nobody on the board had questioned it. Most of them were afraid of her. Ones who weren't afraid of her simply didn't care enough to fight her. That was the culture of Hargrove Heights, a slow, suffocating bureaucracy of minor tyrannies, and Margaret Calloway sat at the center of it like a spider in a perfectly maintained web. Diane Okafor had moved into Unit 4C 14 months ago. Her divorce, and after the accident that had left her daughter Amara dependent on a wheelchair for mobility. Amara was 9 years old. She had dark, serious eyes and a gap-toothed smile that she saved for people who had earned it. And she loved drawing maps of imaginary cities in spiral notebooks. She also had a spinal condition that made stairs not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous, which meant that the elevator in Hargrove Heights, Elevator B, the one closest to their unit, was not a convenience for the Okafor family. It was a necessity. It was the difference between Amara getting to school and Amara being stranded. It was infrastructure. It was in the most literal sense. Part of what made their lives livable in that building, the morning of March 4th started like most mornings. Diane had gotten Amara up at 6:30, helped her through her morning routine, packed her school bag with the meticulous care that had become second nature over the past 2 years, and loaded her into her chair by 7:15. They had a rhythm. It was tight, but it worked, and it depended on the elevator working too. Diane pressed the call button for Elevator B at 7:18. The light came on. The hum of the cable system activated. She could hear the car moving. Amara was drawing something in her notebook, a harbor, with tiny ships not looking up, utterly unbothered by the bureaucratic friction of their building. She had learned in the way children do, to exist in the eye of storms she didn't fully understand yet. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Diane pushed Amara's chair inside, pressed the lobby button, and the doors slid shut behind them. That was normal. What happened next was not. The elevator descended to floors, and then it stopped. Not the gentle, calibrated stop of a car reaching its destination, a hard, abrupt stop. The kind that makes the cables shudder and the fluorescent light overhead flicker once, twice, and then go completely dark. In the sudden blackness, Amara's pencil scratched across the page and went still. Diane reached instinctively for her daughter's shoulder. "It's okay," she said, though her voice had the specific quality of a person saying words they are not entirely sure are true. She pressed the door open button. Nothing. She pressed the lobby button. Nothing. She pressed the emergency call button. And somewhere in the building, a phone rang and rang and rang, and was not answered. What Diane did not know what she could not have known. Standing in that dark metal box with her 9-year-old daughter was that 42 seconds earlier. On the ground floor in the maintenance corridor behind the lobby mailboxes, Margaret Calloway had used her override key to cut power to Elevator B. She had done it deliberately. She had done it because she was furious about an ongoing dispute with Diane over a parking space that Margaret had decided, without any formal authorization, belonged to her guest parking rotation. She had done it because she believed in the entitled and profoundly distorted moral universe she inhabited. That inconveniencing Diane Okafor was a reasonable response to a disagreement about a parking space. She had done it without knowing, or perhaps without caring, that Diane and Amara were already inside the car. And she had done it while 3 security cameras recorded every second of her actions in crisp, time-stamped high-definition footage that would, within 72 hours, be seen by a lawyer, a police detective, 2 local news stations, and eventually more than 4 million people on the internet. But in that moment, none of that existed yet. In that moment, there was only the dark and the hum of the building around them, and Amara's small voice asking, "Mom, why did the lights go off?" And Diane pulling her daughter close in the blackness of that stopped elevator car, pressing her chin to the top of Amara's head and saying with every ounce of steadiness she could manufacture, "We're okay. We're going to be okay." She did not know if that was true, but she said it anyway because that is what you do when you are a mother. In the dark, the maintenance phone in the lobby rang 11 times before anyone picked it up. The person who finally answered was not building management. It was a part-time security guard named Felix, who was technically responsible for the lobby desk. From 6 to noon, but who had been in the back room eating a breakfast sandwich when the call came in. Felix was 23 years old, had been on the job for 5 weeks, and had never dealt with an elevator entrapment before. He listened to Diane's voice through the crackling intercom, calm, deliberate, the kind of calm that people achieve not because they aren't afraid, but because they have decided that panic will not help them. And he told her he would call building management right away. He then spent 4 minutes looking for the building management emergency contact list, which had been filed in a binder that someone had moved to a different shelf without telling anyone, before finally finding a number and calling it. The property manager, a man named Gerald Sims, let it go to voicemail. Felix called again. Voicemail again. He called the management company's main line and was placed on hold. Inside the elevator, Diane had turned on her phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the dark and bounced off the steel walls, giving the space the quality of a camping trip gone wrong. Amara had stopped drawing. She was sitting very still in her chair, and Diane could see the particular set of her daughter's jaw, that careful, controlled expression Amara got when she was working hard not to show that she was scared. It was an expression Diane recognized because she had seen it in the hospital twice, and once in a waiting room, when a doctor had used words that were too large and too frightening for a 7-year-old to process. She recognized it because it was the expression of a child who had learned earlier than she should have, that sometimes the adults around you are also afraid, and that the only dignified response to that shared fear is to not add to it. "Tell me about the harbor," Diane said. Mara looked at her notebook. "It has a lighthouse," she said. "The lighthouse keeper's name is Obi. He's been there for 40 years. Diane asked what the lighthouse looked like. Amara described it. The spiral staircase, the brass light mechanism, the way the beam swept out over the water every 8 seconds exactly, and as she talked, her voice lost some of its tightness, and Diane leaned against the wall of the elevator and listened, and they stayed that way. A mother and her daughter, making a world inside a stopped box, because that was the only thing available to them. 30-8. Minutes passed before the elevator moved again. Felix had eventually reached a junior property manager who had the codes to restore elevator power from the building's central panel. Nobody had yet discovered that the power had been cut manually. Nobody had yet looked at the camera footage. Nobody had yet connected the stopped elevator to the woman who had been standing in the maintenance corridor at 719A.M. with an override key in her hand. When the power came back on and the elevator descended the remaining 2 floors, and the doors opened into the lobby, Amara was the first one to speak. She looked out at the lobby at Felix, who was standing there looking pale and relieved, at the ordinary morning light coming through the glass front doors, and she said, in a voice that was almost completely steady, that took a long time. Diane pushed the chair forward. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. She stopped walking and stood for a moment in the lobby, breathing, letting the open space settle around her. And then she took out her phone and called the school to tell them Amara would be late. Then she sat down on one of the lobby benches and stayed there for a while, her daughter beside her, neither of them saying anything. The morning light falling through the glass in long, bright strips across the floor. Margaret Calloway was not in the lobby. She had gone back upstairs to her unit 2A and was, at that moment, drafting an email to the HOA board about the ongoing parking dispute. It was Felix who pulled the camera footage, and he did it almost by accident. The junior property manager, once she had restored power to the elevator and taken a cursory report from Diane, had attributed the malfunction to a possible electrical issue and said she would have a technician come look at the panel the following week. That explanation satisfied nobody but threatened Nobody either. It might have remained the official story indefinitely if Felix making conversation with the building's head of maintenance 3 days later hadn't mentioned that the elevator had cut out mid-ride with a resident inside. The head of maintenance, a heavyset, meticulous man named Raymond, who had been keeping this building's systems running for 19 years, frowned and said that didn't sound like an electrical issue. It sounded like a manual override. If it was a manual override, there would be a log entry, and the log entry would tell them exactly who had used the code and when. Raymond pulled the log. Then he pulled the camera footage from the maintenance corridor, which covered the panel where the override key was kept, and he watched 47 seconds of video. It made him go very quiet in a specific way that people go quiet when they have seen something they cannot unsee. On the footage at 7:19 a.m. on March 4th, Margaret Calloway could be seen walking to the maintenance panel with deliberate, purposeful steps. Not the steps of someone responding to an emergency, not the steps of someone who had heard an alarm or received a call, but the steps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. She could be seen inserting the override key. She could be seen turning it. She could be seen watching the indicator light on the panel change from green to red, which meant the car was stopped, which meant whoever was inside it was now trapped. And then she could be seen walking back toward the elevator bank, pausing briefly near the closed doors of elevator B, where on the other side of that door, Diane and Amara Okafor were now sitting in the dark, and then continuing toward the stairwell and going upstairs. Raymond watched the footage twice. Then he went and found Felix and showed him. Felix watched it once and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "We need to call somebody." Raymond agreed. The question was who? They called the property management company first, and specifically they bypassed Gerald Sims and called his supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had been in property management for 30 years and who, when she watched the footage, said 3 words that Raymond would remember for a long time: "Get a lawyer." Patricia then called her company's legal department. The legal department called Diane Okafor that afternoon and told her there had been a development in the investigation into the elevator malfunction, and that they believed the incident had not been a malfunction at all, and asked if she would come in to review some footage. Diane watched the video in a conference room at the property management company's offices, sitting across a table from Patricia, a paralegal, and Raymond. She watched it once all the way through without speaking. Her face did not change expression in the way that faces sometimes don't change, not because the person feels nothing, but because what they feel is too large and too complicated to be accurately expressed by any single human expression. When it finished, she asked them to play it again. They did. She watched Margaret Calloway walk to that panel, insert the key, turn it, and then pause outside the closed doors of elevator B, outside the door behind which her 9-year-old daughter had been sitting in the dark, and something shifted in Diane's face then, something specific and irreversible, the way a fault line shifts quietly before the ground starts moving. She asked if she could have a copy of the footage. Patricia told her their legal department would make that determination. Diane said she understood. She thanked them for their time. She picked up her bag, and she drove home. And she called a lawyer before she had even gotten out of her car. The lawyer's name was Christine Adayemi, the kind that existed at the intersection of disability rights. But when Diane sat across from her and described what had happened, the elevator, the dark, the 38 minutes, the footage, Christine Adayemi leaned forward in her chair and said, "I want to see everything." Over the following 2 weeks, she built a case that was not complicated in its facts, but was devastating in its clarity. There was an elevator that served as her primary means of accessing the building. There was a person with a maintenance override code who had used that code to stop the elevator while the child was inside. There were potential violations of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and a handful of state statutes that governed the rights of disabled residents in multi-unit housing. There was, in Christine's assessment, enough here to keep a courtroom very busy for a very long time, what Christine had not anticipated. It was never entirely clear how it happened. The property management company maintained that they had not released it. March it appeared on a local news station's social media page under the headline, "HOA board member caught on camera trapping disabled child in elevator." The clip was 47 seconds long. showed Margaret Calloway walking to the panel, inserting the key, pausing outside the doors. By the following morning, 4 million. And a network of disability rights advocacy organizations who shared it with the specific and focused fury of people who had been waiting a long time for. A story like this to have camera footage attached to it? Margaret Calloway, for her part, released a statement through a personal injury attorney she had hired not, but the kind you hire when you need someone to stand between you and consequences, and that she deeply regretted any distress caused to residents of the building. It did not explain what maintenance concern would require stopping an elevator that had already been called to carry passengers. It did not address why, if she had believed there was a maintenance emergency. She had not called building management or the fire department, the traditional burial ground of news cycles, and it did not succeed in changing the narrative, because the narrative was the footage, and the footage did not require interpretation. The HOA board met in emergency session and voted to suspend Margaret's board membership pending an investigation. Gerald Sims was placed on administrative leave by the property management company. Christina Dimey filed a civil complaint naming Margaret Calloway, the HOA, and the property management company, and Amara Okafor, who knew that something large and strange was happening in the world outside her apartment, but who had not been told the details. Finished her map of the imaginary harbor, gave the lighthouse keeper Obi a cat named Compass, and asked her mother if they could get a fish tank. The civil case settled 14 months later, under terms that were confidential but that Christine Dimey described in a public statement as comprehensive and meaningful. What could be reported? The HOA had agreed to a full audit of its accessibility, infrastructure, and the implementation of an independent accessibility oversight committee that would include at least one resident with a disability. The property management company had overhauled its emergency protocol training and its policy on maintenance override access, which would no longer be held by HOA board members under any circumstances. Margaret Calloway had agreed as a condition of the settlement to complete a course on disability rights and fair housing law, and she had resigned from the HOA board. She had also sold her unit at Hargrove Heights and moved away. Stayed. Whether she had done so because of legal pressure, social pressure, or simply because she could no longer walk through the lobby without people knowing exactly who she was and what she had done. Nobody said officially, but she was gone. What the settlement could not address, what no settlement ever fully addresses, was the 38 minutes. They happened. They're part of the permanent record of Amara Okafor's childhood, filed in the archive of things. A child experience that she should not have had to experience, alongside the hospital visits and the diagnosis and the specific, grinding difficulty of navigating a world that was designed without her in mind. Diane thought about those 38 minutes often, in the months after. She thought about them when Amara was having a hard day, when the spinal pain was bad, when the school called about accommodations that weren't being met, when she found herself standing in a lobby somewhere, calculating whether there was an elevator, and whether it was working, and whether she could trust it. She thought about what it meant that her daughter had been locked in a dark box by someone who had decided that a parking space dispute was worth more than the safety of a child she had never spoken to. She thought about what it said about power, who has it, how it accumulates, what it does when it is never questioned. But she also thought about something Amara had said. About 2 weeks after the incident, when the story was everywhere and reporters were calling the building and the internet was doing what the internet does, Amara had been at the kitchen table, working on a new map, a mountain range this time, with a village at the base of the tallest peak, and she had looked up without particular fanfare and said, "Mom, are people mad because of the elevator?" Diane had said yes. Amara had considered this for a moment. Are they going to fix it? Diane had said she hoped so. Amara had nodded as though this was reasonable and had gone back to her map. She drew the village with very careful detail. Small houses, a central square, a road that wound up the mountain toward wherever the mountain led. She did not name the village. When Diane asked her about it later, she said she hadn't decided on the name yet. "I want it to be a good one," she said. "Names matter. They do." The name of what Margaret Calloway did was not a maintenance concern. The name of what she did was deliberate, targeted, and it endangered a child. The name of what the cameras captured was evidence. The name of what followed, the outcry, the legal action, the policy changes, the resigned board membership was consequence, which is what accountability looks like when the systems designed to prevent harm have already failed, and the only remaining mechanism is a lens that saw everything in a world that finally looked. In the name of what Diane and Amara did inside that stopped elevator, in the dark for 38 minutes, making up a harbor with a lighthouse and a keeper named Obi, the name of that is resilience, which is not a virtue that people choose. So much as a muscle that gets built, slowly and painfully, by a life that keeps making it necessary. Amara is 10 now. She finished the mountain map. She named the village eventually. She named it Compass, after Obi's cat, because she liked the idea of a place whose name meant you can find your way.